Hello, and welcome to Direct Initiative, the podcast where we talk about direct democracy and the importance of ballot measures. I'm Alex Kawa, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about the cons of direct democracy, specifically some of the most common arguments against such a system, as well as what some of the responses to them may be. Now, there are two main arguments in particular that I want to focus on, and the first is minority rights. And this is perhaps the biggest concern regarding direct democracy, the fear that putting the power of lawmaking in the hands of the majority may threaten the rights of the minority. There has been a substantial amount of research conducted on the impacts of mob rule, as it's known by its detractors, much of which, admittedly, is cause for concern. For instance, as Michelle Romero, the program manager for the Our Democracy program of the Greenlining Institute, points out that nearly 3/4 of Californians believe that the initiative system has been used to threaten certain groups' rights, with nearly half believing that their rights have been under threat. An issue in particular that has received attention as a right that has been threatened by the ballot measure process is same-sex marriage. In 2011, Professor Daniel Lewis conducted an analysis of same-sex marriage bans in U.S. states and found that states with some form of direct democracy were almost 3 times more likely to ban gay marriage than in states without it. Author Amy L. Stone further corroborates this claim, writing, quote, "From California to Maine, from North Dakota to Texas, the LGBT movement has lost same-sex marriage bans at the ballot box. Many of these ballot measures were super defensive marriage acts, which write into the state constitution not just a ban on same-sex marriage, but also anything like marriage, such as domestic partnerships. The LGBT community in Colorado, Alaska, and Washington also confronted ballot measures to eliminate or prevent domestic partnerships. The escalation and use of marriage bans by the anti-gay right made this time period, from 2004 to 2009, one of the most difficult ones for the movement. Of the 38 referendums and initiatives on the ballot during those years, the LGBT movement won only 8. As a result of these defeats for LGBTQ rights at the ballot box, Stone states that it required the community to rethink its tactics, including building more movement infrastructure out of ballot measure campaigns. However, in spite of these concerns, the overall evidence regarding the supposed threats that the ballot initiative process poses to civil rights is mixed. Lewis even admits that much of the existing academic research on this subject is largely theoretical and lacks, quote, empirical evidence to condemn these institutions for impairing minority rights. In particular, he cites Switzerland's high rate of direct ballot initiatives leading to a minimal suppression of minority rights. However, he also cites research finding, quote, that 78% of a sample of anti-minority initiatives and referendums in the United States passed. This passage rate dwarfs the 33% rate for other ballot measures in the sample. Professors Todd Donovan and Sean Bowler further remark that there is a lack of data regarding the impacts of direct democracy on minority rights, particularly in comparison to the current system of representative democracy. Additionally, their findings include, quote, that minorities are less protected by direct democracy in smaller communities, places that we assume have a greater homogeneity of interests. And if we are to argue for direct democracy at the national level, as one of the purposes of this podcast is to do, this is an important factor to consider when taking into account how minorities may be impacted under such a system. But even so, the evidence that does exist that direct democracy does have at least some impact on minority rights is cause for concern and should be addressed. The best way to do this is to preclude the possibility of even allowing for direct votes on constitutionally protected issues, including issues pertaining to free speech, freedom of religion, racial and LGBTQ+ issues, among others. This is a point emphasized by attorney and political commentator David French in his book Divided We Fall, in which he outlines his proposal for a system of healthy federalism. Quote, under healthy federalism, American citizens would enjoy guaranteed civil liberties that didn't waver or vary from state to state, and they would enjoy a much greater degree of local control. The fundamental social compact would remain intact for all citizens, but public policy would be variable, customized for local interests and local values. While French's vision differs from the one outlined in this episode and this podcast, it does come from a similar principle, that citizens should have the right to experiment with public policy while still ensuring that their basic civil rights and civil liberties are protected at all costs. This would address the concern regarding minority rights under a direct democratic system. In addition to concerns of mob rule, another concern brought up by critics of direct democracy is the influence of big money. As Romero argues, the fact that it costs up to $2 million in California to merely qualify an issue for the ballot shuts out groups with low and moderate means from running successful campaigns on the issues of importance. Academics Todd Rogers and Joel Middleton additionally conducted, quote, a precinct randomized field experiment to test the influence of independent interest groups on ballot initiatives. They find that, quote, these organizations can have a consequential and significant effect on the passage and rejection of ballot initiatives. As these interest groups may be often well organized and well funded, this can be a true barrier to ensuring that the voices of the people are accurately reflected in the results of the initiative. However, Rogers and Middleton do state that their findings, quote, are in contrast with findings suggesting that campaigns do not have an effect on initiative outcomes and work suggesting that only campaigns against initiatives are effective. This could be attributed to the fact that Americans may experience a status quo bias in which their intuition tells them they want change, but they are too afraid to seek such progress in this regard. In fact, there is evidence to suggest that the opposition groups have a built-in advantage due to this bias, as well as the fact that they are able to make the voter question whether they truly believe in the policy that is being voted on. An example of this occurred in 2016 in Maine, when there was a ballot measure to provide for universal background checks on gun purchases. Despite polling showing that Mainers overwhelmingly supported this policy, they rejected it by a narrow margin, in large part due to an ad campaign run by the National Rifle Association. And it didn't matter that the NRA was outspent by groups supporting the measure. All that mattered is that they were able to sow doubt in the minds of Mainers, which led them to reject something that they otherwise would have supported. In addition to American interest groups, foreign influence in these initiatives is also a cause for concern, owing to a 2021 ruling from the Federal Election Commission, which stated that, as ballot measures do not technically count as elections, foreign actors, including individuals, governments, and otherwise, cannot legally be barred from spending money in support of or opposition to these ballot measures. On its face, this ruling is simply ridiculous, as ballot measures are indeed part of the electoral process and should thus be subjected to the same rules and regulations that apply to other elections. In fact, given that these are voters' only chances of directly making their voices heard in numbers regarding specific issues, it's arguable that they should be even more regulated than typical elections. Obviously, the FEC's decision should be reversed, and there has been legislation introduced in Congress to do so, including by New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. Overall, while the issue of money in ballot measure votes is definitely problematic, solving it often goes hand in hand with addressing the issue of money in other elections. However, for the purposes of the influence of money on direct ballot measures, Senator Mike Gravel, who we talked about in the first episode, in his proposal for direct democracy, does outline how to confront such an influence in his proposal for such a system. He outlines this in his proposal for an electoral trust, which is meant to separate lawmaking powers between citizens and representatives of government, to outlaw contributions from non-individuals toward initiative committees, and to set the threshold for the number of votes an initiative would need to become law. While this is a workable framework for such a trust, I feel like it should be expanded to further cover the minority rights issue that we discussed earlier, because I mentioned that constitutional issues, especially pertaining to human rights, should largely be off the table as far as ballot initiatives go in order to prevent true tyranny of the majority. However, what is and what is not a right can be up for debate. For instance, up until recently, abortion was considered a constitutional right, and it's only because of the change in the makeup of the Supreme Court that it is no longer considered such. Therefore, I think it's important for the Electoral Trust to be empowered with the ability to decide what is and is not acceptable to be voted on with regards to human rights. And these decisions should primarily be made by people who are experts in the fields of law, particularly constitutional and human rights law. So I've spent the first 3 episodes of this series going over, I think, the basics of direct democracy, why I think it's needed, why I think it helps improve voter turnout, as well as some of the cons of it. So now that I've kind of gotten the basics out of the way, I want to start talking about certain ballot initiatives that are being voted on. I want to potentially interview people who are on the ground organizing for these ballot measures. I also maybe want to continue to do analyses on the specifics of direct democracy in a certain way, or maybe even more broad general topics regarding it. So I'm excited to see where I take this podcast, and I hope that the people who have been watching this so far have been enjoying it, and that you continue to do so. And if you're listening on YouTube, please subscribe and like this video and comment for the algorithm. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please follow. If you're listening on YouTube, you can check out the podcast on streaming platforms and the links below. Follow it on social media as well. Of course, as always, further reading is in the description. Thank you all very much for listening. I will see everybody soon. Have a great day. I'm Alex Kawa, and this is Direct Initiative.